You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this discussion now. The Gauteng Democratic Alliance has launched a Promotion of Access to Information Act request. This is to try and force Premier Panyaza Lesufi to release what it claims are hidden forensic investigation reports. The DA alleges that the documents show corruption and maladministration at the Social Development Department. The Gauteng DA's Moriarty is my guest tonight, and he joins me via the virtual platform. Mr. Moriarty, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. I'd like to start this conversation with a question based on your statement that you've issued today, and you say, for far too long, we have been calling on the Premier to release all the forensic reports, a plea which has fallen on deaf ears. How far back does this matter go?
This particular matter that is the focus of attention at the moment, the key one, goes back to 2016, 2017, when there's various initiatives through the Social Development Department to do food banks, have some scheme to issue school uniforms, and also dignity packs, and one or two other schemes. And the way that it was performed was deemed irregular by the Auditor General, and was then the subject of various investigations. But these weren't the only investigations that have taken place over the last 4 or 5 years. You might recall that at the height of COVID, there was a scandal around PPE procurement by the Department of Health. There was millions wasted on sanitization of certain schools under Mr. Lesufi himself, when he was then the MEC for Education. There was the procurement of a hospital at a cost of 500 million rand, which was wastefully spent. All of these things were the subject of forensic investigations. In fact, there's a total of 177 investigations. That's a huge amount. And we've struggled. We've called for these investigations to be made available to the members, the colleagues of mine that sit in the Oversight Committee that oversees the work of the Premier. There's been various calls by my colleague, the leader, Solim Simanga, in the House. Often these are met with vague pronouncements that, yes, that they've been done, they're available, but when we ask for details, they're not forthcoming. Yeah. The most recent request of ours came in the form of a letter. It started in September, when we asked the Premier to provide these reports. That one, there was no response whatsoever. And then most recently, a reminder to the Premier that we were waiting for these reports, and we gave him till Monday. If he'd provided them, then we would obviously have studied those and then taken whatever action we deemed necessary after that, but he didn't. So we've had to resort to that piece of legislation that promotes access to information, and we've made an official request. They call it PAIA, Promotion of Access to Information Act, and we've done that, and we await the outcome of that PAIA application. Yeah.
I've done a quick search, as you stated in your first response, that this matter goes back, or goes as far back as 2016. Premier Makhura was the Premier at that time. Were you as vociferous at that time to ask for these reports to be released? Because it's been a very long time. Premier Lesufi only started recently to lead the provincial government.
Well, the fact of the matter is that we didn't know that it was happening at that stage. You know, the ability to know that there are forensic investigations is very curtailed. From time to time, we've had to write to the then Premier, going as far back as Nomvula Mokenyane. It was our habit of writing occasionally, said, give us a list of what investigations there are. In earlier times, we were able to have access to some of these investigations, but through Mr. Makhura's time, that dried up to an extent. But we didn't know that these the scandals that were happening in the Social Development Department were happening, but for rumors that we were receiving from various people The questions would then be asked in the committee that oversees social development. My colleague, Refilwe Ntshiga, was very vociferous in those committees calling for the information. In the House, repeatedly, we called upon Mr. Makura to disclose what was happening from forensic investigation point of view. We even called for lifestyle audits to be done, and all of these things were met with obscure responses. So yes, we were vociferous.
The reason I'm pressing you on these questions about whether the resort to PAIA, to using the PAIA Act in order to get these reports released, is premised on what some are saying this is nothing but a witch hunt. In all probability, the Democratic Alliance wants to get even with Panyaza Lesufi because of his refusal to work with the DA in the so-called government of provincial unity. Is that effectively what is at play here?
Not what is at play. We are always seeking to combat corruption. And we made it clear to the ANC, even during the time of the negotiations, that our role as a watchdog, even within the government, would not cease. And what we would have done when we're in government would be continue to call for investigations and call for the outcomes, and specifically call for consequences for those that are found to be guilty. No, that whether we're in government or in opposition, it doesn't matter. We're very comfortable in our opposition space. It's a space that we know very well, and it's a job that we are very effective at, and we're continuing to do that. It's a continuation of what we've done all the time.
In your statement, let's get now to the nuts and bolts of why you want these reports released, because you are saying that corruption is serious and takes away money that could have been used to improve and deliver basic services to our residents. What proof do you have that these reports and the reason they are being buried, allegedly, is to hide exactly that corruption has been at play?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because the difficulty that we've had up until now is that we haven't had sight of any forensic investigations at all. Certainly, we haven't been able to get them through the official channels. But what has happened, the whistleblowers have come forward. There are two particular reports. One was an investigation undertaken by a firm called BDO, and there was a series of reports undertaken by another firm called Bowman's. We've been able to get hold of those, not through official channels, but through whistleblowers. But for those whistleblowers, we would not have known. And what we see in these reports are hundreds of millions of rands irregularly expended through conduit channels that shouldn't have been the case, supply chain management regulations that have been flouted, the allegation that the prices that we pay for these goods have been grossly inflated. Once you inflate these goods, and once somebody is on the take somewhere because of some nefarious supply chain or procurement process, that is a wastage that takes place, and it has to come from somewhere. It can only come from service delivery. We've seen the amounts that are involved in those cases. We've also seen that there were people that were recommended to be suspended. And strangely enough, they were suspended for quite some period of time. And then at the beginning of this year, Mr. Lesufi, for reasons that he needs to explain, decided to bring them back to work. They are not the only ones that have been implicated in some form of corruption, have been the subject of investigations, that have actually found their way back into office, or even at some stage were being appointed. But when we blew the whistle, when people called upon us to act, and we threatened to bring in the Public Service Commission, then there was a particular appointment that was due to be made at the head of this very agency, the Department of Social Development, and we managed to, through our outcry, our vociferous outcry, if you use that word, they managed to change their minds. But for our watchdog role, these things would happen and more money would be wasted. This isn't going to be the end, Paulie. We are clearly seeing that even through these two cases, and there's 175 to go, there's a lot that's been happening.
Yeah.
And I dare say that the problem that is at play here is not that we are not in government, it's we are not in government for a reason. The ANC doesn't want us there because they don't want us to have the kind of access to the kind of information that we're now getting from whistleblowers. They don't want us to get it in an upfront and personal way.
That's a very interesting view.
Very interesting view.
Let's talk about the Social Development Department. In fact, it's two quick questions I have for you before we wrap. This department, it stands out. It's quite prominent in your statement. How big a mess do you suspect MEC Mbali-Hlophe, the former minister, this former MEC rather, of social development in Gauteng, how big a mess do you think she's left behind?
Well, she's left a huge mess in various ways, and I think to give her a bit of credit, she inherited that from her predecessor. So this has gone back a long way. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the annual report, there's a total, a cumulative total of 1.1 billion rands worth of irregular expenditure. That's the size of what we're talking about. That's been accumulated over the last 3 or 4 years. And unfortunately, that one department is not alone in this kind of irregular expenditure. The Department of Health, their figure runs into the 20s of billions. There's a huge amount of money at play here, Paulie.
Final question. Now that you've submitted this promotion of access to information request, how long before you get any kinds of responses? But ultimately, when do you think you can have access to these 177 reports?
Oh, that's a good question. The fact is that there's nothing stopping the Premier to say to us tomorrow, here it is, come into the office, come and have a look at these reports. So he's not bound to do it with not less than a period of time. He's actually bound to do it within 30 days. So let's say in 30 days' time, we get an answer. That answer could be that we get access. The answer could be that no, for various reasons, we are not going to get, because those people that have this kind of information are entitled to the Act to decline such a request. If that is the case, we would appeal, and then there's a further 30 days. So it could be within this first set of 30 days. It could be that we get declined, in which case we'll appeal. There'll be a further 30 days. If they then refuse our appeal, well, then we're going to have to look at all sorts of other options, including the possibility of going to a court. But we think that that would be a very sad day for openness and transparency and the need to combat rampant corruption if that's the way that this Premier is going to go.
Yeah. Mike Moriarty, I'm letting you go, I promise. But here's a cynical question as a parting shot. In Parliament today, Phala came up, and I seem to recall the Democratic Alliance at National during the negotiations for the now GNU, and specifically that question around Phala came up, and the DA was quite clear. We will not revive Phala. We cannot have our GNU partner investigated for such. I'm paraphrasing. I can't quite recall how Helen Zille put it at the time. So here's my question to you. If Premier Lesufi were to change his mind and say, DA, I'm willing to work with you, come into government, would you still want these reports released, or would you act in the same way that your leaders at National acted around Phala Phala?
I just want to do one thing before I answer your question, and it's going to be a very straightforward answer, by the way. In the Phala Phala matter, the National Prosecuting Authority is still to come before the relevant committee. Glynis Breitenbach will be there to test the reasons why the National Prosecuting Authority doesn't want to prosecute. So it's not one of those things that is we're saying, well, let's let it go into a rug. By no means. And even if they do say, well, we're not going to prosecute, the DA will be saying, well, you have to issue what they call a nolle prosequi, which would allow anybody that has cause to then bring a private prosecution. So Phala Phala may or may not be the end of the story. It might be according to the NPA, but we'll see what happens from here. But in this particular matter, if the Premier did come to us, we would say to him, well, look, let's talk about power sharing, and let's talk about it in a meaningful way, which is what they didn't do the previous time around. But we say, by the way, we're still here to combat corruption, so we're not going to let these things go if you bring us in.
Mike Moriarty, thank you very much for your time. The DA's Gauteng leader in this province.